All right, welcome everyone. It's very exciting to be at the second Elm Europe.
Yeah.
I'll warn you, I'm quite jet lagged, so I'm going to do my best to be energetic, but it's trouble. Okay, so I've been working on Elm for about 6 or 7 years now, and one of the things that you sort of get used to over time, or it's just part of the job, is people on the internet telling you things. So I collected some that I remembered. Elm is wrong. Is Evan killing Elm's momentum? And when I first read it, I was like, but I made it. This person nearly had a heart attack. So a lot of people feel very strongly, aggressively. I'm not sure exactly how to say this, but it's often hard to deal with these sorts of interactions. So on some level, it's kind of funny, right? Like Elm is wrong. The post is kind of like a self-parody, but it's not. Like it's so over the top angry that you're like, is this a joke about how angry people can be? But anyway, what ends up happening with these posts is like, as time has gone on, I kind of am used to it, but a lot of people in the community end up engaging with these things. So like with this one, between Hacker News, our programming, and our Elm, more than 300 comments. And so if these are taking 5 minutes, 10 minutes, like this is a significant like amount of energy from people that could be towards like being with your family. Like there's other things than this person's issues. And with the is Evan killing Elm's momentum, that one had 94 comments on our Elm. And I know that one in particular was stressful for some community members. I was very heartened by people who sort of got what Elm is about, but it's still very stressful to sort of deal with these kinds of situations. So I think a lot about why these tough interactions happen in the first place. And I have a bunch of theories about structural reasons that how the internet is set up is sort of made for these sorts of things. Or like aggression. Like if you make someone mad and they try to process that information by telling their friend, but then their friend gets mad and they try to process that information by telling, like you've essentially created a viral mechanism for like ads. But all those people have to get mad in the process. So that's one way to go. I actually wrote a big section of this talk about that. And I was like, no. So we're going to focus on like what is success. So a lot of what's happening in these conversations is there's just a fundamental disagreement about what the goals are of the language or where it should go. And so it's not like you can necessarily see eye to eye, or you're not necessarily going to agree with any of these people. But you can at least understand where they're coming from and understand why their value system's different. And maybe that's the best case outcome. It's like, oh, we think it has a different priority. So once we start asking this question, it's like, well, is success being like Haskell? Is it monthly blogs and weekly YouTube videos? Is it frequent releases? So the rest of this talk is going to be exploring theories of success and like what kind of makes sense. So theory one is it's just success is what it is in JavaScript. So you got to maximize your stats. You got to have the most packages published. You got to have the highest number of download counts. You got to have all the GitHub stars. You got to have tons of blog posts. And I don't strongly relate to these. Some of them are weird to me, right? So one thing I notice on the NPM website is they say, what can you make with 700,000 building blocks? And to me, it's like if you said, what can you make with 10,000 kitchens? It's like eggs. I don't. And I recently was hearing, someone was like, hey, did you hear this project has more stars than that? And I was like, well, why are you telling me that? Right? Like, it's like my favorite comedian has fewer Twitter followers than other comedians because he doesn't go on Twitter. But he's still a very good comedian. Like, it's a very weird way to sort of organize how you think about things. And second is we need frequent releases. And what's nice about this is you get these new features, but the downside is you have a maintenance cost. And so what's common in programming languages, I had a slide that was just language after language of like timelines of releases. And I was like, let's go through the TIOBE index of most popular languages and see if any of them have had a 2-year gap. And like Java has big gaps. C has like 10-year gaps. JavaScript has a 10-year gap from ES3 to ES5. So it's like, is it a dead language now? Like, how does this work? So like when you look at languages, it works one way, but when you look at packages, it works different. So I think one thing that people underestimate is like when Elm core library changes or the compiler changes, every single package in the whole ecosystem has to change, and all the applications have to change. So that's a lot of work to ask a whole community to do, and it doesn't make sense to do that lightly, I don't think. But if the root of a bunch of projects is changing frequently, all the other packages changing frequently becomes a proxy for their health, because if they're not keeping up with the core of the ecosystem, then they're not maintained. So a lot of these end up being proxies for sustainability. Like, if a bunch of people have put a star on GitHub, it probably means there's a bunch of people you can hire. If there's a bunch of packages published, it's like, well, I guess people are doing things. And if there's blog posts coming out, maybe there's a marketing budget, so maybe there's a budget. So rather than using proxies for sustainability, why not just have the value of like sustainability? Maybe that's what success is, like having a language that can survive and it will be immune to things going wrong. So I think it's interesting to look at the history of Python. So the creator of Python wrote these 2 blog posts sort of outlining how the early stages, well, not early stages, but the whole sort of life cycle of Python went. And so I'm sort of distilling it down. So in 1991, he's working at a research institute in the Netherlands and releases Python on Alt Sources, the news group. And things go along well. And then in the summer of 1994, the news group was buzzing with a thread titled, "If Guido was hit by a bus," about the dependency. So what's interesting is like, that's kind of the same timeline of people started asking me about my bus hitability. They're like, so, like, I know you'd be dead, but like, what about me? So in Guido's case, he was invited to this National Institute of Standards of Technology. And I guess the idea was that things would be standardized. I don't know if that's actually what happened. I have a feeling that the answer to the question is like, what if so-and-so was hit by a bus? Is like, it'd be bad. Like, I think that's the general answer, but it's something people worry about. So after he goes there, he ends up at another research institute, this time in Virginia. And he works there 5 years and then joins a company called beopen.com. So this is in the .com boom, and they're hiring a bunch of open source people. And I don't understand the business model, and apparently it didn't work. So when the bubble popped, they went out of business, and it sounds like it was trouble. And so he says, luckily, my team, by now known as Python Labs, was pretty hot, and we were hired as a unit by Digital Creations, one of the first companies to use Python. So he joins them in 2001. Now, I don't know if this means that they'd been using it for many years, or companies started using it in that time range. But the thing that's interesting to me is the team that was built around Python was a valuable asset. So even if one company had trouble, like having a team of highly skilled people is a desirable thing. So they end up being fine. And after that, Python was used at Google. He got hired there. It's used a lot for configuration there. And then at Dropbox, which is probably the biggest Python user in the world, probably. So I think this is interesting because it, I think, gives some lessons about Elm's scenario. So as it is, Elm, I work at Nerd Inc., and this is a company that does education software. So if there's a big tech crash, well, the money doesn't come from other tech companies, it comes from schools. So it'd have to be something with how schools work. And it's not really clear what that would look like. And it doesn't seem like it'd be strongly correlated with other things in the tech industry. So it doesn't seem like it's in a risky situation. But let's say something unforeseen happens. There's a couple paths. One is like, can we do something like Python Labs? There's a bunch of people who are now out of work. They work well together. They have a lot of skills. They can come to a company and say, hey, do you like skills? It seems like a good pitch to me. So this seems like a viable path. Another thing that Guido did for a long time is doing a 50-50 arrangement where he'd do half time on Python and half time on something else. I could do that. It seems reasonable. It's like the root question here is like, do I have marketable skills? And it's like, I think so. Like, I think I don't know. And there's a bunch of other alternatives that I like less, but they're things of other projects who are experimenting with crowdfunding. We have a foundation that can do nonprofit stuff. So there's a bunch of other paths here. So this is one theory of success, but I don't think it's so interesting because I think we're sort of, it's just there. It's not a big deal. So another theory might be a diverse community. So again, I'm going to look to Python. I like Python, how their community is developed. So we'll see how Python looks and how Elm might look. So in Python, one strong niche is servers and scripts. So this is software engineers. Another niche is scientific computing. So you get a bunch of educators and researchers. And another niche is education. So high school students, college students. My mom actually learned Python recently because she was like, I want to learn Elm. And I was like, just learn Elm. And she's like, but I want to be prepared. I'm like, it's like you can ask me things. It's fine. But so what's interesting about these niches in Python is that they actually support each other in interesting ways. So when educators and researchers use Python for scientific computing, they say, man, it'd be cool if I could have my students know about this stuff. And furthermore, there's all these jobs out there, so I'm actually like not messing up by teaching these students this because there's a career path. And then these students who are educated, they end up being software engineers. Some of them end up being educators and researchers. So you get these strong feedback loops that make it a really healthy ecosystem. And so if you're into the TIOBE ranking of languages, Python's number 4 on there, above JavaScript. And I think it's in large part because they have these strong sub-communities that have different interests. So my question is, we have user interfaces, we have software engineers, but could we do something similar and create these same kind of feedback loops? And I think something that's important for Python is that it's a very simple language. Like in theory, Ruby could be for scientific computing, it could be for education, but it's not. And I think that is partly because of the difficulty of the language. And in scientific computing, you have people who just want to get results. They don't want to be programmers. So I think these are more plausible than they seem. So with education, there's a course at the University of Chicago now. It's actually taught by Ravi, who's on the board of the Elm Software Foundation. So I don't know if there's like a plan that comes from this though. Like it seems that university professors they do what they want and they make their own curriculum. So there's not really a lot that can be done besides hoping that people are like, yeah, it seems nice. And a lot of the work I'm planning on doing is about making Elm like pleasant to use. So how can we make our tooling better? How can we make our error messages better? And so as that happens and improves life for software engineers, it's going to make things easier for learning as well. And so I hope that will sort of feed into this being a good choice to start out in programming. Another interesting use is at McMaster University. So they have a program called McMaster Outreach, where they teach 4th through 8th graders Elm. So this is a student who made a little bird. And that's Elm code. And it's like a pretty cool bird. Like there's a little nostril. Anyway, so they have a whole catalog of other things students have made. And so I just took a quick selection. I couldn't find everything I wanted. There's some very interesting things the students do in, all of these are animated in the actual slideshow, or like the show they have, but they do interesting things where they overlap in really creative ways, such that they have a square moving, but it's in a larger shape, so you can't see it, and it just looks like an eye's blinking, that kind of thing. And what I found odd when I looked into it more is they say, we would like to have 2 hours with each class. And I was like, 2 hours? And then the students just like make a bird. I don't know. I think that's quite cool. And so this overall project inspired some work I did on Elm Friday, which is something we do within NoReading. So this is just one day of work trying to say, how can we support these kinds of students to make these kinds of animations really well? So that code is very old and not documented at all. But if this is the kind of thing you're interested in, I think there's a lot of interesting stuff that can happen here that can really support this kind of usage of Elm. So in my imagination of what Elm Playground could have been if I could focus on it, would be a website like the processing.org that has all these different examples, and students can click around and see things, copy paste things, and sort of put things together in a really interesting way. I unfortunately couldn't focus on that. There's a lot of, people are like, but what about WebSockets? Well, there's lots of things to do, So this one seems like a good thing. If you are interested in that, maybe if you have kids, it's like, I think this is a really interesting area for Elm. So scientific computing, I think, sounds way more unlikely, but I think there's a foothold through data visualization. So we've started to get some libraries that are pretty nice data visualizations. So these are from the line charts library. And I think if this was supplemented with like a CSV parser, maybe there is one, I didn't check. So ways to help doing statistics. So like, can we get p-values? Or better yet, can we account for the possible misuse of p-values if people want to do research papers that are up to the new standards? And so I think there's a lot of work that can happen here. And I don't know if this can ultimately work out, but I think it'd be really interesting to look into. And I have a mention of this talk on storytelling that I gave here, because it feels to me like somehow, even if we have all the tools to make data visualization nice or scientific computing nice, it needs to be conveyed clearly, and I'm not sure how to do that yet. So I think at this phase, it'd be things that are interesting to look into. So I think it'd be interesting to sort of see what happens with this definition of success. But ultimately, I'm not married to these sort of things. I think it'd be nice, to have researchers as part of the community, people who are interested in biology, all these sort of different aspects, I think could be really enriching and give different perspectives. So another theory is to have a healthy culture. So to me, this would mean an emphasis on design, an emphasis on community, and an emphasis on sharing results. So what I mean by design is, well, a thing that people say about Elm, or I hear, is that it's designed for beginners. But it's not. I designed it. I was there. So I know what people mean. Often they mean it's nice. It's like beginner friendly, and it's easy to learn. But another set of people mean that, oh, it's not sophisticated enough, right? So I think this is a compliment and an insult depending on the person. So I want to say why I think this phrase is weird by just looking at a radio. So let's look at it closer. So this is a pretty cool radio. One of the things that's really interesting about it is that based on the design of the buttons, you know how they should be used without really thinking about it. Like these are for pressing. They're shaped for thumbs and index fingers. And these ones are for turning. And they sort of flare out. You can see that there's a part to grip. And so when you just look at it, you're like, oh, this is just a radio. But it's specifically designed so you know how to use it before you think about it. It's just like you just do the right thing. So somehow the instructions are in the item itself. So we could look at this radio and say, yeah, but it's inconsistent, you know? You have all these things that are circles, but those circles are shaped different than those circles. And all the circles have to be shaped the same. That's what consistency is. And this is a criticism people will make about languages from time to time. And you could say it's missing features. It's like, well, I need a much more sophisticated radio for the kind of stuff that I'm doing. Again, people say this about languages a lot. And maybe it's just like, this isn't the radio for you. There's other radios at the store. It's okay. But so the thing I'm getting at is, like, I think those critiques are kind of missing the point. And to me, what's nice about this radio is that it sort of gets at this idea that great design implies great communication. Like, part of why this is a nice radio is that it communicates well. And it doesn't communicate well to beginners. It just communicates how to use it in its own being. So I can't make things as cool as that radio, but I'm going to show some APIs that I try to do a good job, but, you know, those dials are just... You can't compete. You can't compete. So we're going to look at HTTP and a module that's going to exist later called Browser DOM. So with HTTP, I often proceed by starting with exploration. So in this case, it was exploring what exists in JavaScript that I needed to fully cover. So we need to know about XML HTTP request. We need to know that it can have an error and a timeout, and you can load, and if it gets loaded, then all those things exist. And one of them is that you can get all the response headers, in which case it's just a string, and you have to split it on new line with a carriage return, and then you have to split on colons with a space, and then you have to deal with, if there are multiples, which is permitted, you have to decide. You can have progress, and you'd think it'd be the amount loaded over the total, but in fact, the length computable has to be available before the event, the loaded and total can be computed. Then you need to open the request, and it needs to be true, and it can fail with an invalid URL. That's the kind of thing you find out later when someone tells you in a bug report. That was how I found out about it. You can set request headers, you have response type, you have with credentials, you have timeout. And then with each of these, you have questions about, like, okay, so if I set the timeout to infinity or to -1, like, what happens? And are those things we need to worry about? And then we can actually send the thing. But what kind of things can we send? Well, there's this other thing called form data. So you end up finding out that there's like a lot going on. And the presentation of this API isn't so pleasant in JavaScript. And I don't think that's a critique of JavaScript necessarily. So one thing that's happening there is they're adding features as the needs of the domain are discovered, right? And so when you're on the very frontier of discovering how things are going to be, you don't have the luxury to be a designer and say, who's going to need this? Like, how's it going to fit with all these other things? Because you don't know what all those other things are yet. So when I come to it, I have the benefit of it being done. And so you can start to ask different questions. And so when the design I ended up with starts out very simply, so you can get some URL and it'll give you back a string. And the goal of this API is to increasingly show you difficulty such that it builds on the previous stuff. So when we're introducing here, okay, we have this idea of a decoder now. And so instead of giving a string, we're getting whatever that was. So we've introduced one new concept that's not too wild. And we started with something that wasn't too wild. And then we say post, okay, well, there's a body as well. So again, not adding too much. And then later you get to request. And so the idea is that by the time you get to post in the documentation, you this is actually quite a complicated type, but because you've been going along, you have the tools to know what it means. So it's not as cool as dials, but I'm doing my best. So the other case I think is interesting is something that I've been working on recently. So I wanted to cover JavaScript API. So there's scroll height, client height, and offset height. You know what I mean? So you want to know how tall is the whole thing, how big is the hole that you get to look through, and then what about the borders too? And I had a lot of trouble with this, and I was probably for a day, I was just reading MDN docs, and I ended up with a big whiteboard, and I just had drawn everything on the whiteboard and labeled everything, the width and the height. And I had questions like, what is a client? What if there's a client in a client? I don't know. Or can an offset have a height? How tall is your I don't know. So we had this drawing on the whiteboard, and so this is when we did our first attempt to do an API that would cover this stuff. So the idea was you have your basic element, and it might have padding and a border and a margin. And there are these different aspects of it that you might want to measure. And so we were just staring at this whiteboard being what are those? What are they called? And so probably after a half hour, an hour, we ended up with, this is the content, this is the visible content, and this is the visible content with borders. And there's actually a fourth one called visible content with borders and margins. It didn't really fit in the diagram because the name's so long, so I cut it out. But in designing it, the length of it, I was am I failing right now? So this was nice, and we could have a function that got the size. So we can say get the size of some ID for some boundary. So get the size of the whatever content or the whatever visible content. The thing that was annoying about this is that it didn't match with how you would get the size of the window, right? So window doesn't have borders or margins. So you couldn't use the boundary there. So you'd have to get visible content size and get content size. And now you sort of have, okay, so these are function names, but this one has an argument. So maybe it just shouldn't have an argument. There should be 4 of these. And I just felt like something's gone wrong in my understanding. Now, in addition to these being bad, we also had a bunch of things for getting the scroll position. So get the scroll position for the overall page, and then get the scroll position of a particular element. And then you have to set the scroll position and then set the scroll position of elements in particular as well. So I saw this and I was like, I failed, So I actually, this first exploration happened 2 years ago. And I just was like, I don't know. Well, I'll come back to it. So recently I came back to it, and we came up with something cool. And the idea is that we took idea from 3D graphics. So in that context, it's common for there to be a scene, and there's a viewport you look into to that scene. You can move the viewport around, see different parts of the world. So in this version of it, our scene is the whole document, and our viewport is the browser window. And the scene has a width and height, the viewport has a width and height, and the viewport also has an offset, how far it is from the top left corner. And what was cool about this is that it works for elements as well. So say we have a little chat box in a window. This chat box has the same characteristics. So there's an overall scene, and there's a viewport into it, and then we have an offset of where that viewport is. So there's a way to talk about the window and for individual elements in the same way. And so we could say, hey, I want to get the viewport, and you get all this information. Or, hey, I want to get the viewport of this particular element, and you get all the information. And then when you want to set where the scroll is, you can say, oh, set the viewport, or set the viewport of. So what was this, we found a way to make it a lot simpler and have ideas that build upon each other in a much more clear way, right? So if you understand how this part works, that's going to help you understand how it works in elements. Whereas in this design, it was just kind of like everything is bespoke, let's say. So these are some designs I just thought were interesting that I've been working on recently. But I think focusing on this kind of work over just like getting it out the door, right? Because like in this case, I could have said, okay, well this works, so it's fine. But I think a lot of times you end up just sticking with that when you do that sort of thing. And I have a hard time sort of circling back because there's lots of stuff going on. So the second thing that I think is important is community, and there's a lot of things this can mean. So I don't mean knowing about Elm. So like you can, what does it mean to be in the community? And I don't think it's knowing about Elm. I don't think it's like thinking Elm is nice or using Elm all the time. I think it's helping each other. Like I think it's a relational thing. It's not just something you have yourself. And so there's a bunch of places to do that. For me in particular, the meetups are great because being online is weird for me. Like on Slack, you end up getting a bunch of questions when maybe you just want to help someone with something cool. But at local meetups, one thing that I found particularly memorable is someone came and they'd never used Elm before. And they were going to go through the guide, but I was like, okay, but what is exciting? What are you interested in? They said, I want to make the typing of the dead. So this is a game where you're a man with a keyboard like on a lanyard. And you have a backpack that's a Dreamcast, and it's got a very large battery. And then zombies appear, and they have words on them, and you have to type them to death. So I thought that was a really cool idea. And it's actually quite a hard beginner problem, because if you're coming from an imperative background, you say, well, I have a string, and then I have an index into that string. And it's like, okay, well, can we change it to a list of characters that we've typed already and a list of characters that we haven't typed? But what about the case where you have a zombie where the list of characters that you haven't typed is empty? Well, that zombie shouldn't exist because it's been typed to death. So how can we model that? And so we ended up doing a lot of cool stuff just working together on that. And I think that, at least for me, that kind of relationship's really like what I get excited about. And he came back later and had a much fancier version going. I was just like, you could type the zombies to death. And I was like, let's do it with SVG. We can have the zombies like... It was cool, right? So another thing that I think is underappreciated is helping people who have no relationship to Elm. So I was a mentor for Google Summer of Code, and the mentors are invited to this mentor summit where mentors from all the different organizations come and just talk in a free-form way. And one of the things I noticed is people from different organizations. So if someone had a server project, they'd be like, you know, our servers are great, but like the front end we have is terrible. Like it's not presenting our project well. Or like if people had a systems thing or like AI thing, like their community is made of people who have those skills and they're missing all the other people who have the other skills. But all the communities are that way and they all have a surplus of people looking to help in some way. And so I think there's a big opportunity for working across communities that's not being taken advantage of at the moment. And so one of the projects that I really remembered from this event was called Public Lab, and they're trying to help people learn about pollution in their area. And so a lot of the users aren't technical people, they're just people who don't want pollution in their water or on their land. And so it seems like there's a lot of opportunity to help with that kind of thing. This one's just for me, I don't think this is viable at all. But I think Project Gutenberg's awesome, and I really, like, there's some books on there where I'm like, everybody has to read that book. But when you go to Project Gutenberg, I don't know if it's necessarily like inviting. I don't know if you've been before, but it seems like something relatively simple could be done there, and maybe more people end up reading books that are public domain as a result. I want to put the caveat on this one that like code is the easy part. It's going to be difficult to make these relationships and have this kind of stuff happen. But I think it's really interesting to think about how that could look if you come to a project not saying like, man, I want to do Elm stuff, but saying I want to help this, and this is a tool I happen to use. So another thing that I think is important is sharing results. So what is a result? To me, it's a concrete outcome. So one that I saw recently that I think we'll be hearing about, I don't know, was a 3D dice simulation. Another one was a editor, a code editor that was done all in Elm. And seeing that stuff is really, at least to me, really inspiring to see people doing interesting stuff and wanting to know how to do it and explore that kind of thing as well. Another thing that I think I'd really love to see this, and I for sure have no ability to produce it, is an experience report like the following. Hey, we're a consulting firm. We have 3 projects that in not Elm producing N bugs per month. We have 2 projects in Elm producing N over 2 bugs per month. Time spent on bugs costs dollars per hour, so this is saving us a lot of dollars on the Elm projects. Here are all the caveats you should take into account about how the projects are different, all this kind of stuff. And then you title it something that will do well on Hacker News. But I think this is something that could be quite interesting, and it's actually a really hard post to write because companies that have already started using Elm often haven't tracked the data to recreate this after the fact. So I encourage anyone who's seeing this and has the potential to actually track this kind of information. I think this could be a really interesting way to talk to not just programmers, but people who make decisions for programmers. And just like, do you like a lot of dollars or like less dollars? And I think that's a strong pitch for certain people and organizations. So another thing that I think is nice is doing announcements. So if I was lucky enough to be announcing Elm 19, I could say, hey, there's this new version of Elm out today. It addresses some frustration that you have by introducing a technical insight. And here's a comprehensive overview of how it helps you. So not just like what is technically different, but like what affects you and how you do your work. I also anticipated some of the hot takes on Hacker News, so I tried to address those concerns so things are friendlier in the comments. One I have not been able to figure out is, I thought Elm was an email client. Why does it need a compiler? It's like, I just, how many years before it's like not funny? Another one that I don't know how to combat is, speaking of Elm, there's this other project that's not Elm that I think is really cool. Full disclosure, I made it. The classic, like, high on Hacker News comment. And in this case, I think it's important to give it a title that's like talking about how it impacts the person's like emotions in day-to-day life. Like, so it might be a cool technical result, but I think the more important thing is what it means for the particular person. So this talk on storytelling is all about how to do this kind of thing well. And I suspect a bunch of people in here have projects that could have interesting announcements that could be interesting to a broader community. So things that I don't think of as sharing results are saying things to say things. So there's pressure on me to be always saying everything that's going on with Elm development. The trouble is that it's not always very interesting. It's like, still working. Like, and the other thing that's tricky about it is that some things may or may not happen, and that kind of thing doesn't get translated well when you're doing these very quick updates. So at some point in time, I think like, this is going to be so easy, it's going to fit all together nicely, and then it just doesn't. And to keep going, you maybe have to cut that feature, that sort of thing. And that creates a lot of, it's like, yeah, but you said, and all of this conversation is taking time that's like, are we using our time wisely in a collective way? Like, is this the best way for me to be interacting to get good results? Is this the best way for community members to be spending their time? So I think saying things to say things is like, I understand wanting to have a presence and know about all these kinds of things, but I think you can go too far. The other thing is talking bad about other projects. This one, I think, is just like, no one comes out well, and like having started this talk with people talking bad about Elm is just like not nice, you know? Like, you don't have to like every project that's out there, but that doesn't mean you have to go and make your life about that. Right? Like, I have a friend who doesn't like kiwis, and she doesn't eat kiwis. It's pretty straightforward. If she sees a kiwi, she doesn't eat it. That's the end of it. So I think these things combined can create a really interesting ecosystem and place to be. So when I think about what this means sort of in contrast with the JavaScript norms, rather than having all these fast releases, I'm interested in having releases that are worth the upgrade cost, right? Like, if I'm going to impose work on everybody in the whole community, I don't want to be doing that every 3 months just like because it's exciting. It's like, I work with a compiler that has switched to a 6-month release cycle, and I don't release packages, but I still get people telling me like, hey, you have to upgrade to the latest version. And it's like, I released my binaries. Like, but I now am in this maintenance loop because the person I depend on decides that I should be. So having 700,000 packages, I'm interested in having 50 really nice packages. So to go with the kitchen example, it'd be like, I want a knife that's really good and a fork, I don't know. A pan that's good? I don't know. Something that makes more sense than a fork. But I think in the programming I've done, at least, there's not infinite packages that I end up depending on. And what I really want to have is a really solid foundation to work from. And so rather than saying, well, let's just ship it, let's like get it out there, that's, you know, we're going to grow the ecosystem, I think it's more important to focus on like really, really high quality stuff. Yeah, instead of like being cool on Twitter, just like there's local meetups and having personal relationships, and like it's harder to do that kind of thing. Like maybe there's not a meetup in your area, but I think if the goal is to make Elm a stronger ecosystem, then that kind of hard work is what's really important. Like if you burn someone on Twitter, it's like, gotcha, you know, like. And rather than star seeking, I think people should focus on projects they really care about. And I don't think the growth potential is as high, but I think that's going to make a healthier community. So when we take a step back, to me, success is having a healthy culture. And what's interesting about this is I think it feeds all these other theories of success. So if we have a healthy culture, I think that's going to feed into having a diverse community in the sense that someone's going to come in, try stuff out, and they're going to say, wow, like I really like using this library that I wasn't expecting to use. Like it wasn't hard when I thought it would be. Or someone was really helpful, and I think that's going to be really nice. And having a broader community, I think, is going to help with sustainability. I think we're good, but we could be more good, I guess. I mean, it's a weird idea of if something's sustainable, it being more sustainable. Like, I don't, but, and I guess it helps with, I mean, we'll probably get more GitHub stars as time passes. So if that's your thing, then like, that'll help as well. So there'll definitely be more posts that are like, seeking conflict in a certain way. And I hope if we focus on designing things well, having a nice community, and sharing our results, it's not going to be such a big deal that people have different opinions and it's hard to sort of come to agreement with them. So hopefully that's helpful in future conversations or future things you're interested in. And if you're interested at all in the ideas about data visualization, scientific computing education, please come talk to me about it. If you're not interested in that stuff, like I'm happy to talk as well. Like the idea is to meet everyone. So yeah, thank you for listening. Thank you for coming to Elm. We're excited to meet everyone.